This next segment is brought to you by Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office. You know, Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, to loggers, and miners. That was back in 1965, 60 years ago. That's when the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Well, today, Blue Cross and Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care. Partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families and for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. Once again, we're going to take a deep dive into history. And this is all part of Labor 131. This coming Labor Day is the 131st anniversary of the creation of Labor Day as a national holiday. And I always say on this show, every day is Labor Day because we salute workers and what they do in every profession, no matter what they do. Stacy Smith is our featured guest today. She is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University. She's going to talk about what happened right after the Civil War, 1867. But before we get into that, Stacy, talk to me a little bit about yourself. And I always like to find, maybe you can give us a little background, where you grew up, Union family, any of that stuff. Talk to me about it.
So I think I always loved history as a kid, and was always told, well, you can't do anything with history. That's a useless profession. Why would you even want to try to study that? Because it doesn't pay. And I persisted. I was young and perhaps dumb, and persisted in all of that and said, I really think history is important. I grew more and more interested in the topic as I got older. I didn't abandon it. And so I decided to pursue my doctorate in history probably when I was only in my mid-20s. And so here I am now, 20 some years later, and I'm, kind of living the dream, able to become a history professor. And actually more important to me than now is not just knowing that history and studying that history, but relevant to your podcast, using my historical knowledge to really to affect social justice. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a big focus for me now, is how to use my teaching and research toward those ends.
Are your professors organized over there at Oregon State?
Yes, in fact, we are, and it's a very recent unionization in that it only happened it finally succeeded about 6 or 7 years ago. So it's pretty new. We're still fighting for a lot of basic rights like parental leave and the ability for short-term instructors to have job security and better wages. So it's a long struggle, and actually a lot of my colleagues in the history department are really involved in that.
Good to hear. All right, let's go back to 2 years after the Civil War. The year was 1867. And I know you want to talk about something that is kind of, boy, I tell you, you learn something new every day, it's often been said. And I love doing this show because I myself have learned a lot from people like you who have taken that dive into history. The Anti-Peonage Act of 1867. What the heck was that all about, Stacy?
Well, so you're not alone in not hearing much about this. Actually, I don't think most historians, unless they happen to work on the history of New Mexico, know about this incident and this piece of legislation. So maybe your listeners have heard the word peon, right? We use it kind of casually to refer to just somebody who has low status, like, oh, I'm just a peon, kind of meaning I'm just a cog in the wheel and that kind of thing. But peon, the word actually comes from the term peonage, which was a system of labor that was pretty common in Latin America in the 18th through the 19th centuries. And it's relevant to the United States because when the U.S. seized most of northern Mexico in the War of 1846 to 48, U.S.-Mexico War. The United States got these territories that had peonage in them. So California, New Mexico, and Texas specifically had these systems of peonage, and they were in these territories. This was a way to coerce labor. Labor was scarce. And so the wealthy Spanish-speaking people of these territories would bind lower class people, working class people, and Native Americans into systems of peonage. And what this would do is it would essentially turn them into long-term workers by binding them by debt. So, a person takes out a debt with a wealthy landholder and then says, okay, I will pay you off, pay you back by laboring for a certain amount of time. But the problem is, of course, that this is a sneaky system of bondage, because the more you work for the person, the more you end up getting a debt to them, because you have to, pay your room and board to them in addition to working off your debt. You might have to borrow money for them for, your basic necessities. And so people get involved in decades worth of debt to their quote-unquote employers, which have essentially become masters, and the law even refers to them that way. And sometimes people even pass that debt on to their children and grandchildren. So it becomes generational. So when the United States inherited these systems, after the U.S.-Mexico War, there was a lot of concern about what to do with them. And there wasn't a ton of action on this until after the Civil War, because, of course, the Civil War ended with a 13th Amendment that banned slavery and involuntary servitude, says you can't have that anymore. But peonage, is it slavery or involuntary servitude? This was the question that a lot of lawmakers and U.S. Army officials are trying to answer in those years after the Civil War.
Is this primarily the debt we're talking about involving Spanish-speaking people then? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, and it is. But some Americans get in, like white English-speaking Americans get in on it too, because of course there were early Anglo settlers from the East Coast that come to New Mexico, and they adopt the system because it's profitable, and again, labor is scarce, and so it is really kind of, peonage is fundamental to the New Mexico economy. You can't really have this booming economy that they have in the Santa Fe area without having peonage. So you need laborers to do things like herd sheep and work in people's homes. And so this becomes kind of a norm for both the Spanish-speaking inhabitants of New Mexico, but also a lot of the wealthy new Anglo settlers as well.
Okay. So let's talk about post-Civil War, the end of slavery. Really? I mean, many people ask that question today. I know, but the South didn't accept the end of the Civil War, at least the fact that they lost. But apparently, from what I understand, the Republicans were actually kind of like the Democrats of today back then. Because Lincoln was a Republican.
Absolutely.
And he put an end to slavery. And from what I have gathered, they weren't too happy about what was going on with this system, this debt bondage. And maybe you could pick it up from there. What did they do about it at that point?
So the Republicans were essentially what we would think of as the progressive party of this era. And they're absolutely the party that ended slavery. Lincoln was a Republican. And after his death, the Republican Party goes on. Some of the members who are known as the quote-unquote radicals, people like Charles Sumner in the Senate, they start getting reading reports from New Mexico, from Army officers who are stationed there. It's still a territory. It's not yet a state. And these Army officers say, hey, we see a system here that looks like slavery. And slavery was supposed to have been abolished. What are we supposed to do? And so this issue makes it to the floor of Congress, where you've got Charles Sumner, who's this big advocate of civil rights for all, who is in front of the U.S. Senate saying, look, slavery is still going on in New Mexico. And the problem here, again, is that peonage doesn't exactly resemble slavery in that the person allegedly, voluntarily went into debt and agreed to be a servant. So this is what causes a big fracas in the Senate, is this question of, well, is peonage just, you take out a debt and you have to pay it back, which is just, kind of how life works under capitalism? Or is peonage, even if it's voluntary and contractual, is it slavery? And so, or involuntary, even if you agreed to it in the first place, is it voluntary or not? And so this causes a huge conflict in Congress over kind of, should we outlaw servitude for debt or not? And eventually the Republicans push through the Anti-Peonage Act that says that voluntary contractual debt servitude is in fact illegal.
Okay.
Under and it's essentially kind of refining the 13th Amendment, which was just said slavery and involuntary servitude shall not be tolerated. So this law was to kind of push the boundaries of what we think of as involuntary servitude to say it actually also includes voluntary servitude. And this was a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow in this era, the idea that maybe some types of contractual coercion shouldn't be legal, and that they're immoral.
Hold that thought, because I want to pick up from that law, and I have to ask you, think about this. Did that law have any teeth? And, that's a big problem even today with many laws that we see today. And let's fast forward, because think about all those student loans. Think about all that credit card debt we have today. Some things never seem to change. Stacey Smith is our featured guest today. This is part of our Labor 131 series, the 131st anniversary of Labor Day coming up. She is an associate professor of history at the Oregon State University. We'll continue the conversation right after this on America's Workforce. Don't go away. And remember, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. We always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. Let's go back to our featured guest today, Stacey Smith, who is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University, where she specializes in the history of American West and the Civil War and Reconstruction. In fact, she's author of Freedom's Frontier, California and the Struggle Over Unfree Labor. I like that, unfree labor, emancipation, and Reconstruction. That came out in 2013, and she won a prize, the David Montgomery Prize in U.S. Labor History, for that book from the Organization of American Historians and the Labor and Working Class History Association. We're talking about what happened a couple of years after the Civil War, the Anti-Peonage Act of 1867. We're talking about people that were burdened with debt. You want the land? Well, you got to work for it. And sometimes you got to work all your life. And sometimes your kids have to work for it because it's not paid off. So the Republicans that were in charge said, you know what, we got to do something about this. They passed a law. My question, did the law have any teeth? And I'm sure there had to be some pushback. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so the anti-peonage law has a really mixed legacy because of that issue of enforcement. So New Mexico was a federal territory, which meant that it was pretty much under the control of Congress. So Congress sent out and hired special investigators to go into New Mexico and actually break up the system as much as they could, because you could face fines and potentially jail time if you were found guilty of peonage. Well, the federal investigators are going throughout New Mexico. They find that they get stonewalled almost at wherever they go because the rich people in New Mexico are a very tight-knit group. They won't report on each other, right? They won't cooperate with the enforcement of the law. And when the federal government tries to bring indictments in a federal grand jury against several people, dozens of people, for holding people as debt peons, the grand jury, which is made up mostly of these rich New Mexicans, won't indict. And so all the people who are prosecuted and investigated for peonage pretty much get off scot-free. And they really aren't forced to free the debt peons who they have under their control. And after all of that, the federal government kind of gives up on the institution. And there's evidence, I believe it comes from WPA records from the, recorded interviews from the 1930s. During the New Deal, during the Great Depression, there are interviews with people who are still held in peonage in New Mexico. In isolated parts of New Mexico, peonage is still a thing. And so it's not very successful in New Mexico. Now, where it is successful, oddly enough, is that Southerners, white Southerners who own plantations, own turpentine production businesses, begin to use peonage to essentially re-enslave African Americans and actually some poor whites too. So it's unclear whether they actually knew about what was going on in New Mexico. Probably not. But always looking for ways to re-enslave people, these planters and new industrialists use peonage and debt to trap African Americans in long-term servitude. And that has a really complicated and interesting history. At the turn of the 20th century, there were a bunch of exposés about African Americans being held as peons in states, especially like Mississippi, Georgia, Florida. And there was a U.S. Department of Justice investigation that ended up prosecuting and breaking up most of those systems of peonage. And they used the 1867 Anti-Peonage Act to do that. So in the immediate term, it didn't really do that much to stop peonage in New Mexico. But in the long term, like 40 years later, the law was revived and became a tool to try to break up these systems in the American South.
So when did it actually go away? I mean, this is a long process here, starting from 1867. You took me to the 1900s here.
Yes.
And then during the Great Depression. By the way, the New Deal was a great deal. FDR did so many good things. I mean, all the way that period from 1935 through the Kennedy-Johnson years. And then we saw that entire process being unraveled here in the last 40, almost 50 years now. But so it kind of faded out. I mean, I would imagine like post-World War II. Is that right?
I think I think peonage was largely dead in New Mexico, probably by the 1930s. But again, we have narratives of people who were in rural parts of New Mexico who, people are still being held in this weird system called peonage here. Mm-hmm. I think it does persist, at least in New Mexico, until a little bit until the 1930s. I get the sense that in the American South it did go away, but of course the thing that replaces it is convict labor, is when you can mass incarcerate African Americans, sentence them to 10 years to life for petty crimes, and then hire them out to the highest bidder who can work them to death. That actually ends up being, sadly, right, and horrifically a much more kind of profitable and widespread system than peonage ever was.
Yeah, I follow you on that one. So let's talk about today, because these policies that started, 150 years ago, more than that even, are still with us today. I read story after story about, and you know what's going on in America today with the tariffs and inflation and people living, many people are living paycheck to paycheck. College debt, student loan debt, credit card debt in general. I think student loan debt is even more than credit card debt. And some of these folks, it takes a generation or two in order to pay them off. So I have to ask you, isn't that the same thing of what happened in America in years past? Are we living in those same circumstances in effect?
So when I teach about this history, I throw it out to my students. I say, you know what? For thinking about debt bondage and peonage and all of this, there could be an argument that people in this room are debt peons.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm a debt peon. What am I talking about? And students will kind of look at each other and look at me blankly, and then finally one of them will raise their hand and say, "Oh, student loans." And that is what I'm driving at, right? Death is the only way to get out of a student paying back your student loans. And so to kind of walk students through that, right? You voluntarily contracted that debt, but if you were working your entire life to pay that debt off, especially if it was at a high interest rate, then are you essentially a debt peon?
Yeah.
In a way. And the other part of this too is that the kind of criminal justice system, some scholars have argued, the criminal justice system of today, with its interminable fines for people, right? So if you were fined for some sort of offense, even a traffic offense, then you have to pay your court fees and the fine. And if you can't do that, you get fined more. Some people even go to jail for this, for like petty infractions. And not state governments, but local governments make a ton of money from these types of infractions. And it becomes a cycle of debt that some scholars have called essentially the criminal justice system of modern peonage.
Mm-hmm.
And so we might also think of that as a type of debt bondage.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up because for almost 25 years, I served on the Cleveland Municipal Court as a public information officer. And you've probably heard about bail bond reform. It's been all over the country now. And we started it, I want to say, probably almost a decade ago, and it's worked wonders. And especially when poor people, cannot pay a bond. And if it's like a small offense, like an open container, which is like a 4th degree misdemeanor, the bond would be like $50, $100 at max. They can't pay it. So they are spending time in jail for something that may not even be a jailable offense. That's a sad part about this situation when it comes to debt in America. It's a huge issue. I'm so glad that you're a guest here on America's Workforce to talk about what happened in years past. And I'm finding this out in so many of the conversations with people like yourself, that nothing's changed. Nothing's changed in America. It just takes on a different kind of form. And that form today, you talk about debt bondage from post-Civil War. Look what's going on in America today with credit card and student loan debt. So thank you so much for sharing that valuable piece of information. Stacy Smith, who is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University. You take care, stay safe, and stay in touch, okay?
Okay, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Jeff Stouffer on behalf of the American Legion. Once again, you are listening to America's Workforce.